Lovely to see everyone's face. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We are here to celebrate the launch of this stunning book by Robert Seder, The House of Everything. And we were delayed from last year due to the COVID crisis, so we're very happy to have arrived now. And I believe the museum is open again, but I think you probably have to book it well in advance to go visit the museum. But we will have a little visit tonight. We will have a little preview this evening. I'll give a brief introduction and then Robert will launch himself into some great poems. So Robert Seder has published 4 poetry collections, Traveling to the Fish Orchards, On the Beach with Chet Baker, and Writing King Kong, all from Seren, and another book, The Book of Snow, from Two Rivers Press. I suppose now this is 4. First from Seren now. This is our 4th. He has won many awards and nominations for his poetry, including the National Poetry Competition, London Poetry Competition, Forward Poetry Prize, and the Housman Poetry Prize. His work has appeared in many publications and magazines, on TV, radio, and even on London buses. He lives in London, where he works for the BBC, and following earlier careers in publishing, acting, and teaching. He's also been busy in lockdown. He has published 10 lockdown fairy tales. So in praise of The House of Everything, I saw Imtiaz Darko here, I think earlier in a little square, and she has a lovely quote about this book. She says, "This book builds itself into a series of collages, images intricately overlaid to illuminate one another. The poems move lightly, not just from room to room, but between the chambers of the heart, through shadowed spaces to jeweled windows, to doors that might let in the rivers of the world." Thank you, Imtiaz, for that beautiful quote. And also the deputy director of the actual Sir John Soane Museum, which we are celebrating in this book, has said, "We were delighted to have Robert Seder as our first poet in residence at Sir John Soane's museum. His work brilliantly captures the experience of exploring Soane's romantic and picturesque home with its complex layers of illusion and illusion, interpreting his famous place and its collections in new, surprising, and emotive ways." There you are. Robert Seder, welcome. Let's hear from your poems.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you for those lovely words. And thank you too to you and all of the Seren team for taking a bit of a leap of faith with this book, and also for seeing it through all the vicissitudes of the pandemic. I will have thank yous later on, but for now I'm going to plunge into the book. And I suppose the first and obvious question is, why write a book of poems about Sir John Soane's museum? And the first and obvious reason is, I just love the space. I love the place. Ever since I went there when I was a teenager, I've been captivating by its idiosyncratic, bizarre, curious spaces. So that's a good reason. But I suppose the other reason is I wanted to write a different sort of book. This is my 5th book, as Amy said, and my earlier books have been sort of more personal. They've been about my life, my family, about language, about love, a lot of flawed love. And so I thought I'd do something different. I'd step into someone else's world, someone else's space, and bump against the hard edges of their furniture. So it's a different balance, but of course it's still me and my voice, my interpretation, but a slightly different take. Just a word of reassurance here. If you've never been to Sir John Soane's museum, then you have a treat in store. But this book is about a particular book, but it's about all our houses, all our spaces, all our memories, how we create spaces that become repositories of ourselves. So I'm going to take that theme head on with the opening poem of the book, which is called Not Just the House We Live In. Not just the house we live in, but the house we make up. In another language, in another country, where we believe in different gods and die quite differently. Or simply a house in a foreign street we like the look of, where the bakery smells hang for longer, or so it seems, in the morning air. Or maybe the house where love is easy. That balance of intimacy and space just so, and the peacock blue, viridian green, and egg yolk yellow are more vivid than before, like the world glimpsed through coloured glass. And our domestic objects with their own joint history make a trail from room to room. Or it's that house where we work with depth and efficacy, each hour so clear like a transparent cube placed one on another, and our mind's eye there is bright as a magnifying glass. Or even the house we build like this, cantilevered in air, fixed solid in the London clay. So we stand in this architrave and know what we are made of, and almost who we are. Of course, I'm now going to contradict myself, because there is a very specific house at the center of this book. It's a special house. And Soane's friend Isaac Disraeli said of it, "Some in poems have raised fine architectural edifices, but most rare have been those who have built a poem." Great line. And a perfect challenge to make poems of the building. We're sadly not in the house now with a tepid glass of white wine and a nice canapé. But so I'm going to try and recreate and conjure up the space with some help from my noble friends in Sir John Soane's Museum. So here we are at the entrance to the house, which Soane purchased in 1792. And then he extended and extended and extended into adjacent properties. Here we go into the next slide, which is the amber light of the hallway. And here, let me introduce you to Sir John Soane. Next slide. Self-made man, son of a bricklayer, became one of the premier architects of the 19th century. And he was also an obsessive, underline that word, obsessive collector. His collection numbered almost 50,000 objects, meticulously catalogued before his death, and he left his house to the nation with this stipulation, that it be kept as nearly as possible in the state in which I shall leave it. So objects, as you see here, objects absolutely crammed into every space, every room, every alcove. One more slide, Sarah. Yeah, there you go. He's a sort of Miss Havisham, really. The house must be left exactly as he stipulated, and the obsession marks every space within it. It's as if he couldn't stop collecting until he had everything. And that gives the title poem for the book, which is The House of Everything. You can put the camera back on me. The House of Everything. Everything must go in. Fragments of stained glass, ancient cornice and pedestal, odd classical feet, human, animal, odd flowers from the sea, now solid as rock. Great works of the Italian masters in gilded frames, their names like pasta sauces, their tenner-penny idols. And sling in too the grimacing gargoyles for easy contrast, hacked from facades of windy cathedrals. A lank lock of hair from a saint and a sinner, they're one and the same. A missing pistol, its ricochet bullets somewhere in these rooms. Everything, everything. Now recite the list of what you saved. Now the one thing you missed. Its gleaming plinth, its jealous, empty space. So how did I go about writing the book? I think what I first did was just responded to the objects and the spaces that resonated and began to write. And one of the most extraordinary objects, I think anyone who's been to the house, this is the object that they'll recall immediately. It's the sarcophagus, the alabaster sarcophagus of the pharaoh Seti I. And it sits like an extraordinary alabaster boat in the base of the house, in the crypt, in the sepulchral chamber, as it's called. It was too expensive for the British Museum to purchase. So Soane bought it for himself in 1824 for £2,000. He invited all the beau monde to see it, a party that lasted three nights. And he set it in the middle, in pride of place, in the crypt. And it sits there like a boat, waiting to be untethered and go into the underworld. And I think we have a rather wonderful fly-through from the museum, which will give you a perspective on it. and over to me. Brilliant, all my own work, of course. And here's the poem that celebrates the wonderful sarcophagus. Like a boat left in a room, waiting for a door to let in a river, for a current and for a paddle, for a moon in a skylight, waiting for a face to be dipped in milk, for a marble and for a mirror, for a dream left on a pillow, waiting for a day to let in night, for another door and for a key. Now, you don't just get texts in this book. This is double value. You also get visuals. So I've created 10 collages that are intercut between the poems. And I did them for two reasons. First of all, because I wanted to offer visual cues, visual clues, some of the spaces and the objects if the reader had never been to the house before. But also I wanted to, in a way, mimic the collage-like aesthetic of the Sir John Soane Museum, which is full of the broken, the fragmentary, and the multifarious, all repurposed, reassembled into a different aesthetic. So I think Sarah's going to flash up a few of the collages. Here's the sarcophagus with the man and his paddle. Here's the paper cut, which conjures up the fragmented and broken relationships at the heart of the house. And here's the Rake's Progress. So Hogarth's sequence of paintings called the Rake's Progress hangs in the picture gallery in the center of the museum. So a bit more about Soane, first of all. Soane was a very particular melancholy man. He had a sort of depressive streak. And I think this is conjured up and reflected in the house that he created. And one of the very odd things I found when I was researching his life and his work was he would commission all these famous buildings. So he created the Bank of England, he created the Dulwich Picture Gallery, the first public space for galleries in the UK. But when he built the Bank of England, he commissioned a drawing of the building he hadn't even yet created in ruins. So he had this, I mean, we all have a constant questioning of what will remain of us, but he had that underlined several times, a constant questioning of what would remain of him and all his works. So this poem is triggered by that. Sir John Soane imagines the ruins of his yet to be built building. Begin with the end, the ruins, the picturesque pile with only time's crenellations left now in silhouette, and every last window open into air. Begin with the trees, the roots, that slow creep of moss. They were always there, at the corner of your eye. And this clearing in the wood, only ever temporary. Begin with the list of irksome, lost things, the accidents of memory that must somehow be purposeful, and love's strange collisions that wake you in the night. All the things that survive. Another thank you here, a big thank you to Sir John Soane's Museum for having me as their first poet in residence, for sharing its special spaces with me, and also for helping me with the research I did. In particular, Helen Dorey, who Amy quoted at the beginning, who's the deputy director and the inspectress of the museum, who's been a long-standing friend and guide through this very long project. So big thank you to them, and also for the visuals you're seeing tonight. So back into the house and back to the cantilevered staircase. So when you enter it, you see this amazing winding staircase that goes up and up and up. And we'll have a picture of it now. There it is. And the thing about poets is they fall in love with words before they even quite know what they mean. And I wanted to write a poem about cantilevered before I really even knew what it meant. And then I discovered what it meant. It meant something floating in air, but firmly engineered and ballasted in time and space. So a perfect metaphor for life's precarious adjacencies. So this poem is triggered by that. There's one little reference I need to gloss. There's a mention of a Mr. Frick, who was a famous ice skater in the 1940s, and his star skating maneuver was called cantilever. Cantilevered. It's an act of will to believe in it. In fact, let's not think about it at all. A little like breathing or falling in love. So simply walk the projecting treads in air, anchored at one end to the wall of the house, terra firma. Then imagine every bridge, tower, football stadium built like this, as if they floated in air, and you floating with them. And imagine too that skater, stage name Mr. Frick, longtime performer with the Ice Follies spectacle, how he created the cantilever, his show-stopping moment, would flex his knees, bend right backwards, then skate in parallel to the ice. Oh, the cold rush of air, the wonder of almost, but not quite, touching. Another thank you to my dear friend, the poet, Imtiaz Darka, who Amy again referenced. In fact, she put my thunder because I was going to read the quote, which is actually, it's worth buying the book, frankly, for Imtiaz Darka's quote. But there's a second section which Amy didn't read, which I'll just take you through as well. So with a kind of austere precision, this is Imtiaz's words, with a kind of austere precision, the poet suggests the collector's passion, as well as the knowledge that the object of desire will always be just out of reach, lost before it can be grasped. In his house made of poems, we come to know what we are made of and almost who we are. And she's right. Of course she's right. I mean, both personally and biographically, the house has an elegiac mode. And in terms of Sohn, it reflects in particular to his loss of his wife. So his beloved wife, Eliza, died in 1815, and he was left alone in this house for 22 years. And he would walk the walks of the house, the rooms, he would talk to her, he would write to her in French, because he felt he could be more emotionally literate in a different language. And he also designed her tomb. So here we have a picture of Eliza. And there's the wife. And then here we have a picture of the tomb that he created. And strangely, bizarrely, this is one of the quirks of architecture and time. This tomb, 100 years later, became the model for the famous red London telephone box, created by Giles Gilbert Scott. So a perfect conflation for a poem. This is Mrs. Sohn's tomb becomes a telephone box. I'm a tomb. I'm a telephone box. I'm dead. I'm calling from the other side. I'm here. Insert your coins the way we once did. Dial my number. And when you hear my opening words, press the button. Begin to speak. I'm waiting while your fingers fumble on the other side. I'm waiting. And the perceptive among you will, I'm sure, pick up the sort of echo of Orpheus and Eurydice myth, which is one of my favorite myths. So the telephone box brings us sort of up to date, really. And I don't want you to feel the book is immersed in history. It accents history, but it also has lots of encounters with the contemporary and recent. As in the case with this poem, which introduces Audrey Hepburn into Sir John Soane's museum. And I'm sure those of you who saw Roman Holiday will remember that there's a famous scene in it where she and Gregory Peck encounter a mouth of truth. Can we have the image, Sarah? Which looks like this. And the myth is that if you put your hand into the mouth and tell a lie, then your hand will be taken and probably the rest of you with it as well. And there's one of these. This is the one that's in the Sir John Soane's museum. So, and actually in the film, they didn't tell Audrey that Gregory Peck was going to seize her hand. So she actually thought the myth was coming true and she was being consumed. So her uncertainty and conjecture is authentic. Anyway, I imagined Audrey Hepburn entering Sir John Soane's museum, that this is Bocca della Verità, or the mouth of truth. Imagine Audrey here, escaping on her moped with Gregory Peck. Beauty on the run, a princess accent, a wind-ruffled hair, doing the things that common people do in 1950s Roma, eating gelato, dancing on the riverbank, the aching, sun-bleached, black and white glamour of it all. Then everything's stopping. Her small white hand slipped inside the dark, open mouth of the Bocca della Verità, just like the one here. And the gods, the saints, the dead celebrity in his alabaster boat, the severed hands and feet, the talking heads, all pause and listen, just like in the film. What is the forever truth? But then Gregory pulls back her small white hand, saves her from Soane, the dark floating of memory. Time enough for that. There's Gregory's almost kiss coming closer. Jazz of second improvised on second. And the breath-stopping beauty of her here and now profile against the light. Sarah, can we have the collage? And there she is. I mean, the best way to sell a book must be to have Audrey Hepburn's eyes on the cover. Just two more poems. And this one, the next one is also a contemporary encounter. So the contemporary artist, Michael Landy, in 2001, he famously inventoried all his possessions and then destroyed them all. And he wrote, "I'm always trying to get rid of myself." So in many ways, he's very like Soane. They both had possessions. They both did this sort of analytical inventory. They needed to know exactly what they had, but they're also completely opposite. So while Soane kept everything avidly and avariciously, Landy destroyed everything. So I thought I'd get them to meet and see what they'd say. So this is the man who destroyed everything he had meets Sir John Soane. He made an inventory of 300 pages in 10 categories: artworks, clothing, electrical equipment, furniture, kitchenware, leisure items, motor vehicles, perishables, reading materials, studio materials. 7,227 items in all, including even the following: passport and birth certificate, clothing, his father's sheepskin coat among them, works of art, Tracy Emin, Damien Hirst, etc., and his Saab 900 Turbo 16S. The resulting bags of granulated rubbish weighed nearly 6 tons and were all recycled or sent to landfill. Nothing remained, or rather, all that remained was nothing. "Do you ever dream of what you lost?" said John Soane, as he walked the winding staircase of his crammed house, touching his treasured possessions one by one. "Do you ever dream of an empty house?" asked the other. "Walking out of it, yourself on an empty road, carrying nothing but the clothes on your back, listening the sound of your breathing, how the horizon lifts and trembles." I wonder what they really would have said to each other. And this is the last poem of the set. And here we are back at the entrance of the house and the hallway where I first came a million years ago. And this poem's about language and about time, which is sort of one of my recurring themes, really, language and time. And as many of you know, I used to be a language teacher. I taught in Italy and France, and it left me with this abiding fascination of how you teach your own language, and how you, when you do, you step outside it and see it as something almost separate and distant and remote and rather precarious for yourself. Do you want to put the camera back on me, Sarah? And the most difficult tense I taught was a tense called the present perfect continuous. Now, if I were there in person, I'd have a show of hands to know if anybody could identify the present perfect continuous, but there are actually a few careful teachers sprinkled around, so they probably would. But it's that really complicated tense. I have been living, I have been working. Terrible. The Italians could just not get it, because it doesn't really exist in other language. It doesn't exist in America, they never use it. Anyway, it's a tense that relates the past to the present to the future. And I've used it in this poem to reflect the influence of things, spaces, places that stay with you forever. So this is coda, present, perfect, continuous, and it's the last poem of the set. I have been coming here for years. That is the most complicated of English tenses, which my poor Italian students stuttered over when I taught them English in Milan. It's the past connecting to the present, then running into the future. It's a river under this city, now paved over and lost, but rushing on, the dark, messy pulse of it. It's love, underneath so many daily words and actions, making them matter so they glow a little around the edges, and hurt sometimes too, since finding and losing and finding again can do that. It's this house, caught in the weight of this or that object, the light falling on them, then slowly wheeling on. And the young man I was when I first stepped into its narrow hallway, I'd seen the poster on the tube, its collage of heads and patterns that intrigued. And I knocked one late school day afternoon on its "I'm not giving away anything" door. To the biographer I have become, connecting the cut-out moments of a life, repeating the walk from room to room, climbing that giddy, cantilevered stair year on year. So this is who I was and am, this house seems to say, and perhaps will be. I've got two last thank yous. A thank you to my dear friend and designer, Sally James, who has practiced her habitual style, panache, and patience to deliver this beautiful book. So a big, big thank you to Sally. And she's getting married in the middle of it all, so thank you even more. And also thank you to all of you, sprinkled far and wide from Orkney to Cornwall, Spain and France, USA and Australia. I couldn't ask for anything more. And it's lovely to see so many people I haven't seen for a long while. So thank you so much for coming, and I'll hand you back to Amy.
Hi, thank you. We'll unmute everyone in a second so you can do some applause, but we have a question from the chat. We have a couple of questions. Actually, we have one from Dixie Stewart. A question for Robert. If you could take one object from a museum to keep for yourself, which would you choose?
Oh, Dixie, how could you put me on the spot? Well, I mean, the sarcophagus is the obvious one, but that's just a bit big, really, to accommodate. I mean, I think I'd have to have a different object for each day of the week.
Couple of different questions, couple more questions quickly. Robert, you've taken on, from Wendy French, Robert, you've taken on another man's life, personality. Did you ever feel he was taking your personality over? Well, the book, was it hard to let him go?
Yeah, no, he's not that pleasant a man. I mean, he's an extraordinarily haunted man, and he's a depressive man. So it's actually interesting, you know, when everyone's talking about mental health, he's not entirely nice, actually. He has this terrible relationship with his sons, and he becomes bitter and deep. And so I would hope I would not take on his personality. But actually, what's interesting is seeing how his spirit infected the space. I mean, for example, he had this complete fictional monk he created called Padre Giovanni, who basically was completely made up. And it's a sort of perfect personification now, we can see, of his depression. He basically had this monk he made up and he kept in a corner of the house. And there's a poem about him. So it was interesting looking at it through a modern lens of a man who wasn't terribly likable, but was tormented and passionate. And those things are always fascinating. But I hope there's a bit of me in Soane, but not a lot of me.
There we go. And one more question. Are there, Claire Dyer asks, are there other houses collections that you would like to write about?
Well, I'm waiting. I think it has been absolutely fascinating for the reasons I said at the beginning. It's been great writing, using that Eliot term, the objective correlative. So not starting with myself and having something very objective to look at and to immerse myself in a story and a place. I mean, there are lots of challenges, of course, as you can appreciate, because what you don't want to do is turn it into a history lesson. You don't want to turn it into so much fact that basically you obscure anything that's illuminating or personal or creative, really. So it's a judicious use, and also thinking fundamentally, why am I writing this? There has to be a reason that's not just a bit of picture painting. So that was rather a long-winded answer to say it's been a fascinating process. I would, and I've loved doing it because it's been very different, and I've questioned myself about why I'm doing it. And what it means personally and not personally. And so, yes, I would love to do a similar project, but I suppose only if there was a personal, emotional reason, a sort of hook for doing it.
Okay, and we have one more question about Hogarth's pictures that Soane owned, which are like my favorite things there, the wonderful series of Mary Jolly Hope, right? The whole series. They are about disorientating instability, says Jay Seaton. How do you relate to Soane's use of instability in the house to words?
Well, there's a lot of instability in the words. So there is that, as I said, there's that aesthetic, which is the collage thing. So there is this extraordinary object, for example, in the middle of the house called the pasticcio, which is this column, which looks like a perfectly created assemblage, as Soane said, but actually it's completely made up of fragments. And I mirrored that in the poem I wrote about pasticcio. I basically took lines from across the book because they're all inhabiting that world. They're all my perceptions of the world, but they're all dislocated and then reassembled. So it was definitely dislocation and fragmentariness is definitely one of the big themes, and how you make sense of that. I mean, there's also the other theme, which I had to sort of challenge myself with, thinking all these objects have come from all around the world, and they're now stuck in this cabinet of curiosity. Is that justified? Should we give the sarcophagus back? So all those issues that everyone's grappling with at the moment about provenance and about ownership. There's a poem in the book where the items in it, a bit like Toy Story, they sort of discuss what they're doing there, and they debate and say, actually, some of them want to go home, and some of them don't want to go home at all. So there's the great thing about poems is you don't have to reach a hard and fast conclusion. You can have everything quivering in tension, and that's the aesthetic. And just one last thing on the Rake's Progress, because the question was specifically about that. I mean, there is a poem specifically linked to that and the collage, because there is this sinister resonance between the story of the destroyed young man, went to rack and ruin, and Soane's own son. He had two sons, one of whom died early. The other one became a profligate and a writer and basically castigated him. And they had this terrible, terrible relationship, and he kept asking for money, and it sort of broke everyone's hearts, really. So there is, I do wonder if Soane, as he looked at the picture, thought, actually, this is my own personal life, my own personal story, my own personal responsibilities flashing before my eyes.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Robert. I think we'll finish there. Thank you, everyone.